Hi, I'm Camila. When my sister's fiancé, Garrett Thornfield, looked me up and down in my catering uniform and sneered, "Just stay in the kitchen where you belong, help," he had no idea that in exactly 3 hours, his new boss would be introducing me as the incoming CEO of Meridian Industries, the same company where he'd been desperately trying to make partner for the last 2 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The look on his face when I walked into that boardroom, still wearing my catering apron and sat in the chairman's seat? Priceless. But we'll get to that moment in a bit. Before we dive into this wild story, tell me, have you ever been looked down on by someone who thought they knew your worth? Someone who judged you based on what they saw on the surface? Drop a comment and let me know what time you're watching this and where you're tuning in from. Because what I'm about to tell you will show you that sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are setting themselves up for the biggest fall. Let me paint you a picture of how this all started. It was a crisp October evening in downtown Ashford, and I was working a high-end corporate event at the Grandview Hotel. Not because I needed the money, though the extra cash never hurt, but because I genuinely enjoyed the work. There's something satisfying about creating perfect moments for people, even if they never see the person behind the scenes making it happen. I'd been catering events on weekends for the past 6 months, ever since I moved back to Ashford to be closer to my sister Natalie after our mom passed away. It was my little escape from the corporate world. A way to use my hands instead of just my brain to create something beautiful and temporary. Plus, it gave me insight into how different companies operated when they thought no one important was watching. That particular night, I was working the annual gala for Meridian Industries, one of the most prestigious consulting firms on the East Coast. The ballroom was filled with executives in tailored suits, women in designer gowns, and the kind of champagne that costs more per bottle than most people make in a week. I was in my element weaving between tables with trays of perfectly arranged canapes, invisible but essential. That's when I saw him across the room. Garrett Thornfield, my sister's fiancé of 8 months, looking every inch the ambitious junior partner wannabe in his expensive navy suit and slicked back hair. He was working the room like his life depended on it. Which, knowing Garrett, it probably did. The man had ambitions that far exceeded his actual talent, and he wasn't shy about letting everyone know it. I hadn't planned to interact with him at all. Natalie had mentioned he'd be at some work function that weekend, but Ashford is a big city, and I figured our paths wouldn't cross. I was wrong. I was refilling the appetizer station near the bar when I heard his voice, louder than it needed to be, clearly trying to impress someone. The key to success in consulting, he was saying to a group of senior executives, is knowing how to delegate to the right people and keeping the wrong people in their place. One of the executives, a distinguished woman with silver hair, nodded politely but seemed more interested in the bacon-wrapped scallops I was arranging than in Garrett's philosophy on workplace hierarchy. That's when it happened. I was reaching across the table to adjust a garnish when Garrett turned around and nearly walked straight into me. For a split second, his face showed recognition. He knew exactly who I was. But then something else flickered across his expression. Calculation. Opportunity. "Excuse me," he said loudly, loud enough for his audience to hear, "but I think the help should be more careful about staying out of the way." The executives turned to look, and I felt the familiar sting of being reduced to my uniform instead of seen as a person. But Garrett wasn't done. "Actually," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "since you're here, could you make sure there are more of those little salmon things? And maybe clean up this area a bit? It's looking a little messy." He gestured dismissively at the appetizer station I'd spent 20 minutes perfecting, then turned back to his audience with a smug smile. "Sorry about that. Sometimes you have to be direct with the service staff. You know, they respond better to clear expectations." The silver-haired executive, whose name tag I now noticed read Dr. Evelyn Cross, board chair, looked between Garrett and me with interest. But not the kind of interest Garrett was hoping for. "And you are?" she asked him, her voice cool and professional. "Garrett Thornfield, junior associate, hoping to make senior partner soon," he replied, straightening his tie. "I believe in leading by example even in small interactions." Dr. Cross nodded slowly, then looked at me. "And you're part of the catering team tonight?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied quietly, playing my role perfectly. "Well," she said, her eyes never leaving mine, "I hope you'll excuse our junior associate's management style. Some people have very interesting ideas about leadership." Garrett beamed, completely missing the ice in her tone. "Thank you, Dr. Cross. I believe in maintaining professional standards wherever you are." What Garrett didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Dr. Cross and I had been corresponding for months about my transition into the CEO role. What he definitely didn't know was that starting Monday morning, I wouldn't just be his boss, I'd be everyone's boss. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt scripted. Here was a man who measured his worth by how small he could make others feel, about to discover that the woman he'd just humiliated held his entire career in her hands. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how sweet that moment in the boardroom really was, you need to know the whole story. You need to know about the family dinner where Garrett told my sister I was settling for mediocrity, the job interview where he tried to sabotage me, and the moment I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's just success. So buckle up, because this story is about to get very interesting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You know what? Before I tell you how this all unfolded, I need to know something from you. Have you ever had someone in your life who looked at you and decided your worth based on absolutely nothing? Someone who saw your job, your clothes, your circumstances, and thought they had you all figured out? Maybe it was a classmate who judged you for your family's car, or a coworker who dismissed your ideas because of your age, or someone at a party who treated you differently once they found out what you did for a living. Drop a comment right now and tell me about that person. What did they say? How did they make you feel? And most importantly, where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Because I'm telling you this story for everyone who's ever been made to feel small by someone who thought they were bigger. For everyone who's been called just the help, in whatever form that took in your life. Maybe you weren't literally serving canapes like I was that night, but we've all had our moments where someone tried to put us in what they thought was our place. I want you to think about that person while I tell you this story. Think about their face, their voice, that smug expression they got when they thought they'd put you in your place. Hold on to that feeling. Because what happened to Garrett Thornfield that night is exactly what I wish could happen to every person who's ever made you feel less than you are. And here's the thing. I'm not just telling you this story to entertain you, though I promise it's going to get wild. I'm telling you this because sometimes we need to hear that the person who dismissed us doesn't get to write our story. Sometimes we need to know that the universe has a sense of humor and karma. Well, karma has perfect timing. So comment below, who's your Garrett Thornfield? Because trust me, after you hear what happened next, you're going to feel a whole lot better about your own story. To really understand how satisfying this moment was, you need to know the whole picture. You need to understand the world that Garrett Thornfield thought he owned, and how I ended up invisibly moving through it while he had no idea who I really was. Let me take you back 6 months before that catering gala, to when I first moved back to Ashford. I'd been living in Seattle for 8 years, building my career in corporate strategy consulting. I'd started as an analyst at a small firm called Pacific Solutions, worked my way up through sheer determination and some very late nights, and eventually became their youngest senior director at 29. But when my mom got sick, I knew I had to come home. Ashford is one of those cities that thinks it's bigger than it actually is. About 500,000 people, just enough skyscrapers downtown to feel important, and the kind of business district where everyone knows everyone else's business. It's the type of place where your reputation follows you into every conference room, every networking event, every charity gala. The business community here is tight-knit, which can be either a blessing or a curse depending on how you play the game. My sister Natalie had stayed in Ashford her whole life. She worked as a marketing coordinator for a local real estate firm. Good job, steady income, nothing flashy but respectable. She'd always been the social butterfly of the family, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and organized family gatherings. When Mom got diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, Natalie was the one coordinating doctor appointments, managing medications, and basically holding our small family together, while I flew back and forth from Seattle every other weekend. The guilt of not being there every day was eating me alive. So when Mom passed away that March, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I was going to move back to Ashford permanently. My colleagues in Seattle thought I was having some kind of breakdown. "You're throwing away everything you've built here," my mentor David Chen warned me over our final lunch meeting. "Ashford isn't exactly a hotbed of consulting opportunities, Camila. You'll be starting over." But here's what David didn't know, what nobody knew except for a very select few people. I wasn't planning to start over. I'd been quietly interviewing for executive positions across the country for months, not because I was unhappy in Seattle, but because I'd reached a ceiling there. Pacific Solutions was a great company, but it was small, family-owned, and the top spots were essentially hereditary. If I wanted to really test what I was capable of, I needed a bigger stage. That's how I ended up in conversations with Meridian Industries. Meridian wasn't just any consulting firm. Founded in 1987 by a brilliant woman named Catherine Meridian, it had grown into one of the most respected strategic consulting companies on the East Coast. They specialized in helping mid-sized companies navigate major transitions, mergers, acquisitions, digital transformations, crisis management, the kind of high-stakes, complex work that I'd been dreaming about my entire career. When Catherine Meridian announced her retirement after 35 years of building the company, the board of directors faced a choice. They could promote from within, bringing up one of the senior partners who'd been with the company for decades. Or they could take a risk on someone from the outside, someone with fresh perspectives and a track record of results. Dr. Evelyn Cross, the board chair, had been following my work through industry publications for 2 years. She'd read my Harvard Business Review article on adaptive leadership strategies, seen my presentation at the National Consulting Conference, and quietly reached out through a headhunting firm that specialized in executive placement. The interview process was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just about my qualifications, though we spent plenty of time going through my portfolio of successful projects, my client testimonials, my strategic vision for the consulting industry. It was about fit. Did I understand Meridian's culture? Could I lead a team of people who'd been doing this work since before I graduated college? Was I ready for the pressure of being the youngest CEO in the company's history? The process took 4 months. 4 months of video calls, in-person meetings when I could fly out from Seattle, psychological assessments, presentations to different board committees, and scenario-based interviews that felt more like war games than job interviews. Through it all, I kept my mouth shut, not because I was trying to be secretive, but because I knew how these things worked. Nothing was guaranteed until the contract was signed. Corporate boards change their minds, better candidates emerge, internal politics shift. I'd seen too many people count their chickens before they hatched, only to be left explaining to everyone why the sure thing fell through. So when people in Seattle asked why I was moving back to Ashford, I kept it simple. I wanted to be closer to family. I was taking some time to figure out my next move. I might do some freelance consulting while I explored my options. When I told Natalie, she was thrilled that I'd be moving back, but also worried. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" she asked over FaceTime one evening in May. I mean, I'm excited you'll be here, but you've worked so hard to build your career in Seattle. What if you can't find anything good here? I assured her I'd figured out a way to make it work. Which was true, just not in the way she was imagining. That's when she told me about Garrett. They'd been dating for about 4 months by then, and she was absolutely smitten. He's so ambitious, Camila. He works at this prestigious consulting firm downtown, Meridian Industries. Have you heard of them? He's on track to make senior partner in the next few years. He's exactly the kind of driven, successful man I've always wanted to end up with. The irony was so thick I almost choked on my coffee. There I was, secretly in final round interviews to become the CEO of Meridian Industries, while my sister was gushing about her boyfriend's career prospects at the same company. But I kept my mouth shut. The timing wasn't right to share my news, and besides, I was curious to learn more about this Garrett character. What's he like? I asked, trying to sound casually interested rather than professionally invested. He's confident, really sure of himself. He knows what he wants, and he goes after it. Sometimes I think he might be a little intense about success. But I like that in a man. I'm tired of dating guys with no ambition. Over the next few weeks, as my conversations with Meridian's board intensified, I heard more and more about Garrett Thornfield. How he was always working late, always networking, always talking about his 5-year plan and 10-year plan and 20-year plan. How he was frustrated with some of the old guard at his firm who didn't appreciate his innovative ideas. How he was confident that once the company got some fresh leadership, people like him would finally get the recognition they deserved. Fresh leadership, if only he knew. When I finally got the call from Dr. Cross in late June offering me the position, I felt a mixture of elation and strategic satisfaction that I'd never experienced before. But the start date wasn't until October. The board wanted Catherine Meridian to have a proper farewell tour, and they wanted me to have time to relocate and transition smoothly into the role, which meant I had 4 months to quietly observe my future company from the outside, to learn about its culture and its people without anyone knowing who I really was. 4 months to learn exactly what kind of man my sister was planning to marry. And 4 months to perfect the art of being underestimated by someone who had no idea he was about to become my employee. The first red flag about Garrett Thornfield came disguised as what my sister thought was romantic ambition. It was mid-July, about 2 weeks after I'd officially accepted the CEO position, but months before anyone would know about it. I was staying in a temporary furnished apartment downtown while house hunting, and Natalie had invited me to dinner to meet this wonderful man she'd been telling me about for months. The restaurant was Bellacourt, one of those upscale Italian places where the waiters wear black ties, and the wine list has more pages than most novels. Garrett had chosen it, Natalie explained, because he wanted to make a good impression on his girlfriend's sister. He was picking up the tab, which she thought was incredibly generous, especially on his junior associate salary. I arrived a few minutes early and watched them from across the restaurant as they waited for me at their table. Garrett was gesticulating enthusiastically about something, his hands cutting through the air with sharp, precise movements. Even from a distance, I could see the intensity in his posture, the way he leaned forward when he spoke, claiming space. Natalie was listening with the kind of focused attention you give someone when you're still in the honeymoon phase of a relationship. When I joined them, Garrett stood up with a practiced smile and an overly firm handshake. "Camila, I've heard so much about you. Natalie tells me you're in consulting too. What a coincidence." The way he said coincidence made it clear he thought this was one of those small world moments where two professionals would bond over shared war stories. He had no idea he was shaking hands with his future boss. "Something like that," I replied, settling into my chair. "What kind of work do you do at Meridian?" This was the moment I got my first real glimpse into who Garrett Thornfield actually was. His entire demeanor shifted when I asked about his work. The casual confidence became something sharper, hungrier. He straightened his tie, a nervous habit I'd later learned to recognize, and launched into what sounded like a rehearsed elevator pitch. "I'm a junior associate in the corporate strategy division," he began, "but really, I'm being underutilized. I have ideas that could revolutionize how we approach client relationships, but the senior partners are stuck in this old-school mentality. They don't understand that consulting is evolving, that clients want fresh perspectives, not the same tired approaches we've been using for decades." Natalie nodded supportively, clearly having heard this speech before. But I was listening with different ears. In my 8 years of consulting experience, I'd worked with dozens of junior associates, and I knew the difference between legitimate frustration with systemic problems and simple arrogance. Garrett's complaints weren't about process improvements or strategic innovation. They were about not being recognized as quickly as he thought he deserved. "What kind of ideas?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear his vision for the company I was about to lead. His eyes lit up like I'd just asked him to explain his favorite hobby. "Well, for starters, we need to be more aggressive about weeding out the dead weight. There are people at our firm who've been coasting for years, collecting paychecks while the real performers like me do the heavy lifting. If we had better leadership, someone who understood that talent should be rewarded regardless of tenure, we could transform the entire culture." I made a mental note of that. In my experience, people who talked about dead weight in their first conversation with a stranger usually meant anyone who doesn't immediately recognize my brilliance. But Garrett was just getting started. Over the course of our appetizers, he explained his theory that Meridian Industries was hemorrhaging money on sympathy hires, his term for employees who were kept around for emotional rather than performance-related reasons. Women who got promoted because of diversity initiatives rather than merit. Older employees who were allowed to maintain client relationships they should have passed on to hungrier associates years ago. Support staff who were overpaid for work that could be automated or outsourced. "The problem with Catherine Meridian," he said, sawing into his ossobuco with unnecessary force, "is that she's too sentimental. She treats the company like it's a family instead of a business. That might have worked in the 1980s, but this is a competitive market. We need leadership that's willing to make tough decisions." Natalie was hanging on every word, clearly impressed by what she saw as sophisticated business analysis. But I was taking notes for entirely different reasons. Everything Garrett was saying revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what made Meridian Industries successful. Catherine Meridian hadn't built a respected consulting firm by accident. She'd done it by creating a culture where talented people wanted to stay, where client relationships were built on trust and longevity, where tough decisions meant strategic choices rather than arbitrary cruelty. "Have you shared these ideas with your supervisors?" I asked. Garrett's expression darkened slightly. "I've tried. But my direct supervisor, Patricia Walsh, is exactly the kind of legacy employee I'm talking about. She's been there for 15 years, and she's comfortable with the status quo. She doesn't want to hear about optimization or efficiency improvements. When I propose new approaches, she gives me this patronizing smile and tells me I need to, quote, understand the company culture before I can contribute meaningfully." I knew Patricia Walsh by reputation. She was one of the senior partners whose work I'd studied during my interview process. Her client retention rate was above 90%, and she'd mentored more successful consultants than anyone else in the company's history. If she was giving Garrett patronizing smiles, it probably wasn't because she was threatened by his brilliance. "Maybe she has a point about understanding the culture first," I suggested mildly. Garrett's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "With respect, Camila, that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps organizations stagnant. Sometimes an outside perspective is exactly what you need to see problems that insiders have become blind to. I didn't come to Meridian to spend years learning to think like everyone else. I came to make an impact." The server appeared to refill our wine glasses, and Garrett immediately shifted into what I was beginning to recognize as his networking mode. He thanked the server by name. Apparently he came here often enough to know the staff, and made a point of mentioning that he worked at one of the city's premier consulting firms. The server smiled politely and moved on, clearly accustomed to customers who needed to announce their importance. As the evening continued, I started to see patterns in how Garrett interacted with the world around him. He name-dropped clients and colleagues constantly, always making sure we understood how significant his role was in their success. He corrected our server's pronunciation of a wine term with the kind of gentle condescension that made it clear he was doing them a favor by educating them. When Natalie mentioned a book she was reading, he immediately launched into an explanation of why the author's theories were oversimplified, though he admitted he'd only read reviews rather than the actual book. But the moment that really crystallized my understanding of Garrett Thornfield came at the end of the evening. As we were waiting for the valet to bring our cars around, Garrett excused himself to take a phone call. While he was gone, Natalie grabbed my arm with excitement. "So? What do you think? Isn't he amazing?" I looked at my sister, sweet, optimistic Natalie, who always saw the best in people, and realized she had no idea she was dating someone who saw the world as a zero-sum game where his success required other people's failure. "He's certainly confident," I said carefully. "I know, right? He's going places, Camila. He's got this 5-year plan to make senior partner, and then eventually he wants to start his own firm. He's already talking about wanting to headhunt some of the best people from Meridian once he's established enough. Can you imagine? My boyfriend running his own consulting company!" When Garrett returned from his call, he was practically vibrating with excitement. "That was Richardson from the Blackstone account," he announced. "They want to schedule another meeting next week. I think I'm finally making some real progress with the senior partners." As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just gotten a preview of exactly the kind of employee who could poison a company culture if left unchecked. Garrett wasn't evil, but he was something potentially worse. He was convinced that his ambition justified dismissing everyone around him as obstacles or stepping stones. The scary part was how charming he could be when he wanted something. Natalie was completely taken in by his confidence, his apparent success, his grand plans for the future. She had no idea that his version of making it seemed to require making sure other people didn't. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to the stories Natalie would tell me about her relationship, how Garrett would get frustrated when she didn't understand his work problems, how he'd started giving her advice about her own career, suggesting she was settling for mediocrity in her marketing job, how he'd begun making comments about her friends, subtly pointing out their lack of ambition or sophistication. Each story was small by itself, but together they painted a picture of someone who needed to feel superior to the people closest to him. Someone who couldn't just be successful. He had to make sure everyone around him knew they were less successful. I was starting to understand that the conversation at Bellacourt hadn't been Garrett trying to impress his girlfriend's sister. It had been Garrett establishing dominance over someone he saw as competition for Natalie's attention and respect. What he didn't know was that he'd just given me a comprehensive preview of exactly the kind of leadership style I was going to spend the next several years working to eliminate from Meridian Industries. The moment that changed everything happened on a sweltering August afternoon at Natalie's apartment. She'd invited me over to help her plan a surprise birthday party for our late mother's best friend, Ruth, who had basically become our surrogate grandmother after Mom passed. It was supposed to be a simple afternoon of making lists, ordering flowers, and figuring out seating arrangements. What it became was my first real glimpse into what Garrett Thornfield was like when he thought nobody important was watching. I'd been looking forward to this afternoon with my sister. Since moving back to Ashford, we'd been rebuilding our relationship in a way that felt more adult, more equal than when we were kids. Planning Ruth's party felt like exactly the kind of normal, family-oriented activity that had been missing from my life during those intense years in Seattle. Natalie's apartment was a cozy 2-bedroom in the Riverside district, decorated with the kind of thoughtful touches that made you want to kick off your shoes and stay for hours. Throw pillows in coordinating colors, photographs in mismatched frames that somehow worked perfectly together, plants that were actually thriving instead of slowly dying on windowsills. It felt like home in a way my sterile corporate apartment never had. We'd spread party planning materials across her dining table: guest lists, catering menus, flower catalogs, sample invitations. Ruth had been such an important part of our family that we wanted everything to be perfect. She was the one who'd brought us casseroles during Mom's worst days, who'd sat with us in hospital waiting rooms, who'd somehow known exactly what to say during those awful weeks after the funeral, when the world felt like it was moving too fast and too slow at the same time. "I think we should go with the yellow roses," Natalie was saying, pointing to a picture in the florist's catalog. "Remember how Mom always said Ruth's laugh was like sunshine? I feel like yellow flowers would be perfect." I was about to agree when we heard the sound of keys in the front door. Garrett walked in without knocking, which should have been my first clue about how he viewed boundaries. He was still in his work clothes: expensive suit, leather briefcase, the whole corporate warrior costume, and he looked annoyed about something. "Hey, babe," Natalie called out cheerfully. "You're home early. Come meet my sister properly. We're planning Ruth's surprise party." Garrett set his briefcase down with more force than necessary and loosened his tie. "Actually, I need to talk to you about something. We might need to reschedule our dinner plans tonight. The Morrison account is demanding changes to our proposal, and I need to work late to fix the mess that Patricia's team created." I noticed how he framed it. Not that the client had feedback or that the team needed to make adjustments, but that Patricia's team had created a mess that only he could fix. Classic Garrett, from what I'd already observed. "Oh," Natalie said, her face falling slightly. "We were going to try that new sushi place you mentioned. But of course, work comes first. I understand." What happened next was like watching someone reveal their true colors in slow motion. Garrett glanced at the papers spread across the table, taking in our party planning materials with the kind of dismissive scan you'd give a pile of junk mail. "What's all this?" he asked, picking up one of our carefully organized guest lists. "We're planning a surprise 70th birthday party for Ruth," Natalie explained. "You remember, I told you about her. She was Mom's best friend, practically raised us after Dad died when we were teenagers. She means everything to our family." Garrett flipped through our notes with growing irritation. "Natalie, how much is this going to cost? I'm looking at catering for 40 people. Flowers, decorations, a venue rental. This isn't exactly budget-friendly." "It's not that expensive," Natalie said defensively. "We're splitting the costs, and we found a really reasonable caterer. Besides, Ruth deserves something special. She's done so much for us over the years." "That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people stuck in mediocrity," Garrett said, his voice taking on that lecturing tone I'd heard at dinner. "You're spending money you don't have on people who can't do anything for your future. This Ruth woman, what has she actually contributed to your career? Your professional development? Your networking opportunities?" I felt my hands clench involuntarily. The casual cruelty of reducing Ruth to a cost-benefit analysis, of measuring her worth by what she could do for Natalie professionally, was breathtaking in its coldness. Natalie looked stunned. "Garrett, she's family. Not everything is about networking or career advancement. She was there for us when Mom was dying. She helped pay for groceries when we couldn't afford them. She drove me to job interviews when my car broke down. She's not a business contact. She's someone who loves us." Garrett set down our guest list and turned to face Natalie directly. "And that's exactly the problem with your mindset, babe. You're too emotional about these things. You can't afford to waste resources on sentiment. Look at where this woman is at 70. What has all her love and support actually gotten her? She's probably living on Social Security, watching other people's kids grow up because she never invested in building anything meaningful for herself." The accuracy of his guess was particularly cruel. Ruth had never married, had worked as a school secretary her entire career, and was indeed living on a modest pension. But the way he said it, like her life choices were character flaws, rather than different priorities, made my stomach turn. "She's not just other people's kids," Natalie said, her voice getting smaller. "We are her family. She chose to invest in relationships instead of just money." "Chose to invest in relationships," Garrett repeated mockingly. "That's a really pretty way to say she never figured out how to create actual value." "Natalie, you're 26 years old. You're at the age where every decision you make is either building your future or limiting it. Do you want to end up like Ruth? Beloved but irrelevant, surrounded by people who can't actually help you achieve anything significant?" That's when he turned to me, and I saw something in his expression that made my blood run cold. It was the look of someone who just identified a problem that needed to be solved. "Maybe your sister can help you understand this better," he said to Natalie, but his eyes were fixed on me. "Camila, you've built a career in consulting. You understand how successful people think. Wouldn't you agree that Natalie needs to start being more strategic about where she invests her time and energy?" The room went completely silent. Natalie was looking at me with hopeful eyes, clearly wanting me to validate her emotional approach to relationships. Garrett was watching me with the confident expectation that any fellow business professional would obviously side with his ruthlessly practical worldview. What he didn't know was that he'd just made the mistake of assuming I was the same kind of person he was. "Actually, Garrett," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "I think Ruth sounds like exactly the kind of person successful people learn to value. In my experience, the most effective leaders are the ones who understand that loyalty, emotional intelligence, and genuine care for others aren't obstacles to success. They're the foundation of it." Garrett's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Well, sure, those things have their place in professional relationships, but we're talking about personal resources here. Time and money that could be invested in career development, networking with people who can actually open doors." "No," I said, standing up from the table. "We're talking about the kind of person Natalie is, and the kind of person she wants to be. And from what I can see, she's already way ahead of most people in understanding what actually matters." I started gathering up our party planning materials, making it clear that our afternoon wasn't going to be derailed by his cost-benefit analysis of human relationships. "Ruth's party is happening," I said firmly. "And if you can't understand why celebrating someone who's shown up for this family deserves our time and money, then maybe you need to think about what kind of values you want to bring into this relationship." The look Garrett gave me in that moment was pure calculation. I could practically see him reassessing me, trying to figure out if I was a threat to his influence over Natalie or just someone who needed to be managed differently. What he settled on was a patronizing smile that made my skin crawl. "Of course the party should happen," he said smoothly. "I'm not saying Ruth doesn't deserve celebration. I'm just encouraging Natalie to think strategically about balance. But you're right, family is important." The sudden shift in his tone was almost more unsettling than his original cruelty. This was Garrett realizing he'd overplayed his hand, backtracking just enough to avoid looking like the villain, while making it clear that his objections hadn't actually changed. After he left for his urgent work session, Natalie and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, she spoke up. "He's not usually like that," she said quietly. "I think he's just stressed about work. He's under a lot of pressure to prove himself." I wanted to tell her that stress doesn't turn someone cruel unless the cruelty was already there, waiting for an excuse. I wanted to explain that people who truly care about you don't need to be convinced that your loved ones deserve celebration. I wanted to point out that someone who could dismiss Ruth so casually would eventually find reasons to dismiss her too. Instead, I just squeezed her hand and said, "Ruth's party is going to be beautiful, and you're exactly the kind of person she raised you to be." But as I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake the image of Garrett's face when he realized I wasn't going to automatically side with him. There had been something calculating in his expression, like he was filing away information for future use. I had no idea how right I was. After the Ruth party incident, something shifted in how Garrett interacted with me. It was subtle at first, the kind of change you might miss if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying very close attention, because I'd seen this pattern before in corporate environments. Someone challenges a person like Garrett once, and suddenly you're not just another face in the crowd anymore. You're a problem to be solved. The first sign came 2 weeks later, at Ruth's actual birthday party. We'd managed to pull off the surprise beautifully. 40 of Ruth's closest friends gathered at the Riverside Community Center, yellow roses everywhere, her favorite lemon cake from the bakery, where she'd been buying treats for 50 years. When we all shouted, "Surprise!" and Ruth burst into tears of joy, I knew we'd done something meaningful. The kind of meaningful that can't be measured in quarterly reports or networking opportunities. Garrett had agreed to attend, though he'd made it clear this was a sacrifice of his valuable Saturday afternoon. He arrived exactly 30 minutes after the party started, late enough to make an entrance, early enough to avoid looking completely disrespectful. He'd dressed for the occasion in what I was beginning to recognize as his casual but still important outfit. Expensive khakis, a button-down shirt that probably cost more than most people's entire party budget, and loafers that screamed, "I could be doing something more significant right now." What happened next was a masterclass in passive-aggressive social manipulation. Garrett worked the room like he was at a client reception, shaking hands with elderly neighbors and introducing himself as, quote, Natalie's boyfriend from Meridian Industries. But every interaction seemed calculated to demonstrate how different he was from everyone else in the room. When Ruth's neighbor Bob, a retired mechanic, started telling a story about fixing cars in the 1970s, Garrett listened with the kind of polite smile you give children when they're explaining their imaginary friends. "That's fascinating," Garrett would say in a tone that made it clear he found it anything but fascinating. Manual labor must have been so different back then, before everything became automated and efficient. When Ruth's former teaching colleague, Mrs. Chen, mentioned her volunteer work at the local literacy center, Garrett nodded thoughtfully and said, "It's nice that you found ways to stay busy in retirement. Not everyone has the opportunity to pursue meaningful second careers." Each comment was technically polite but carried an undertone that positioned him as someone who understood real success, while everyone else was playing at significance. But it was his interaction with Ruth herself that really showed me who Garrett was when he thought he was being charming. Ruth had pulled me aside earlier to tell me how proud she was of both Natalie and me, how our mother would have been thrilled to see us building lives we loved. When Garrett joined our conversation, Ruth made the mistake of treating him like family. "Garrett, dear," she said warmly, "Natalie tells me you work at one of those big consulting companies downtown. That must be exciting work." "It is," Garrett replied with practiced modesty, "though I have to say it's refreshing to meet someone like you who's found fulfillment in simpler pursuits. Not everyone needs to change the world, right? Sometimes just touching a few lives in your community is enough." The casual condescension was breathtaking. Ruth, who had mentored hundreds of children during her decades as a school secretary, who had organized community fundraisers that built playgrounds and bought library books, who had quietly supported families through crises for 40 years, was being patted on the head for her simple pursuits by someone who spent his days making PowerPoint presentations about operational efficiency. Ruth, bless her heart, didn't even catch the insult. She just smiled and said, "Oh, you're so kind. I always told the children that everyone contributes in their own way." But I caught it, and when Garrett's eyes met mine over Ruth's head, I saw something that made my stomach clench. He wasn't just being unconsciously condescending, he was testing me, seeing if I would call him out again, or if I'd learned to stay quiet when he was just being friendly. The pattern escalated over the following weeks. Every time we ended up in the same social situation, Garrett would find ways to subtly undermine or dismiss people around him, while positioning himself as the authority on what really mattered. When Natalie's friend Jessica mentioned getting a promotion at her nonprofit job, Garrett congratulated her while explaining how competitive the real business world was compared to the nonprofit sector. When her coworker Marcus talked about his weekend photography hobby, Garrett shared his thoughts on how creative pursuits were nice stress relievers for people who didn't have demanding professional responsibilities. But what really bothered me wasn't just his condescension towards strangers. It was how he was starting to treat Natalie. It began with small corrections during conversations. If Natalie mentioned something she'd read in the news, Garrett would gently explain why her understanding was incomplete or oversimplified. If she shared an opinion about a movie or book, he'd offer a more sophisticated perspective that made her viewpoint seem naive. "I love how you see the world," he'd say with an indulgent smile. "You have such an optimistic take on things. It's refreshing, even if it's not always realistic." When Natalie got excited about a new marketing campaign she'd helped develop at work, Garrett listened with the patient attention you'd give a child explaining their crayon drawing. "That sounds like a good learning experience for you," he'd say. "Small companies are great places to practice before you're ready for more complex challenges." The worst part was watching Natalie start to internalize his feedback. She began prefacing her opinions with disclaimers like, "I know I probably don't understand all the complexities, but," or, "This might be naive, but I was thinking." I watched my confident, intelligent sister start to shrink herself to fit Garrett's vision of who she should be. When I tried to address it with her, she defended him with the kind of logic that breaks your heart. "He's just trying to help me grow," she explained after Garrett had spent 20 minutes explaining why her favorite restaurant was, quote, "fine for what it is, but not really sophisticated enough for important client dinners." "He has experience in high-level business situations that I don't have. I want to learn from him." That's when I realized what Garrett was really doing. He wasn't just being arrogant. He was systematically undermining Natalie's confidence so she'd become more dependent on his approval and guidance. Every gentle correction was an investment in making himself indispensable to her sense of self-worth. The breaking point came in early September, at a networking event that Natalie had been excited to attend. It was a young professionals mixer hosted by the Ashford Chamber of Commerce. Exactly the kind of event where someone in marketing should have been able to shine. Natalie had bought a new dress, practiced talking points about her company's recent successes, and spent an hour getting ready because she wanted to make a good impression on potential contacts. Garrett insisted on driving us there together, which should have been my second red flag of the evening. The first was how he spent the entire car ride preparing Natalie for the event. "Remember, this isn't like your usual work crowd," he instructed while navigating downtown traffic. "These are serious business people. You'll want to focus on listening more than talking. Ask questions that show you're interested in learning rather than trying to prove how much you know." By the time we arrived at the Marriott downtown, Natalie looked nervous instead of excited. She kept smoothing her dress and checking her reflection in shop windows, second-guessing herself in a way I'd never seen before. The event itself was exactly what you'd expect from a Chamber of Commerce mixer: business cards, small talk about quarterly projections, and the kind of networking conversations where everyone tries to figure out if the person they're talking to can help their career. Natalie should have been in her element. Marketing professionals are supposed to be good at reading rooms and building relationships. Instead, I watched her become increasingly quiet as the evening progressed. Every time someone asked about her work, she'd glance at Garrett before answering, like she needed his permission to speak. When a pharmaceutical company executive expressed genuine interest in her firm's approach to digital marketing, she deflected the conversation to Garrett's much more impressive work in consulting. The final straw came when David Wellington, a senior marketing director at one of Ashford's largest companies, approached our group. David was exactly the kind of contact Natalie should have been excited to meet, someone with the authority to hire marketing firms and the budget to make meaningful decisions. "I heard you worked on the Riverside Medical campaign," David said to Natalie. That was brilliant work. The way you positioned their urgent care services completely changed how people think about medical accessibility in this city. Natalie's face lit up. This was exactly the kind of recognition she deserved. But before she could respond, Garrett stepped forward with his most charming smile. "That's very kind of you to say," Garrett said, as if the compliment had been directed at him. "Natalie did some great execution work on that project. Of course, the strategic foundation and conceptual framework were developed by the senior team, but she really excelled at the implementation phase." David looked confused, clearly not understanding why this random man was answering questions about Natalie's work. But Garrett was just getting started. "Marketing is such an interesting field," Garrett continued. "There's so much creativity involved, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to understanding business fundamentals. That's where Natalie's been working to strengthen her skill set, learning to think more strategically about how creative work fits into larger business objectives." I watched David's expression change from interest to polite confusion to barely concealed irritation as Garrett essentially mansplained Natalie's own career to someone who wanted to hire her. But the worst part was watching Natalie stand there and let it happen, nodding along as her boyfriend systematically undermined her credibility with someone who could have changed her professional trajectory. When David finally excused himself with a business card that went to Garrett instead of Natalie, I knew I was looking at something more than just garden variety arrogance. This was calculated sabotage, designed to keep Natalie dependent on Garrett's approval, while ensuring she never developed the confidence to outgrow him. That night, as we drove home, Garrett spent 20 minutes explaining to Natalie how she could have handled the conversation with David better, how she needed to work on her executive presence, and learn to think like a business person instead of just a creative. Natalie listened to every word, taking mental notes on how to be worthy of the opportunities that Garrett was systematically ensuring she'd never get. I sat in the back seat, watching my sister disappear a little more with every piece of helpful advice, and realized that this wasn't just about protecting Natalie anymore. This was about understanding exactly what kind of man was about to become my employee, and what kind of environment he was creating for everyone around him. Because if this was how Garrett treated the woman he claimed to love, I could only imagine how he treated the people at work who couldn't fight back. The moment that crystallized everything I'd been seeing, the incident that made it impossible to stay silent anymore, happened on a crisp October morning exactly 1 week before I was scheduled to start as CEO of Meridian Industries. Natalie had called me at 7 in the morning, crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. "Camila," she sobbed into the phone, "I need you. Can you come over? Something terrible happened." I threw on clothes and drove to her apartment, my mind racing through possibilities. Had someone died? Was she hurt? When she opened the door, I could see she'd been crying for hours. Her eyes were swollen, her hair was a mess, and she was still wearing the same clothes from the day before. "What happened?" I asked, pulling her into a hug. That's when the story came tumbling out, between hiccups and fresh tears. The previous evening, Natalie had been offered the opportunity of a lifetime. Morrison & Associates, one of Ashford's most prestigious marketing firms, had contacted her directly about a senior marketing specialist position. Not through a recruiter, not through a job posting. They had specifically sought her out based on her work with Riverside Medical and several other campaigns that had caught their attention. "They said they'd been watching my work for months," Natalie explained, wiping her nose with a tissue. "The salary was almost double what I'm making now, and I'd be working with major clients across the region. It was everything I've ever wanted, Camila. Everything." The interview had been scheduled for that morning. Natalie had spent the entire previous week preparing, researching the company, practicing her presentation, even buying a new portfolio case to showcase her work. She was more excited than I'd seen her since before she started dating Garrett. But when she told Garrett about the opportunity, everything went wrong. "At first, he seemed supportive," Natalie continued, settling into her couch and pulling a blanket around herself. He said he was proud of me for being recognized. But then he started asking questions about the company, about the role, about what it would mean for our relationship. The questions had started innocently enough. How many hours would she be working? Would there be travel involved? What kind of clients would she be handling? But as Natalie described her answers, I could see exactly where this was heading. Morrison & Associates was known for their demanding schedules and high client expectations. The position would require some evening events and occasional travel to client sites across the state. It was exactly the kind of role that could launch someone into the upper echelons of marketing, but it would also require complete professional dedication. That's when Garrett got quiet, Natalie said. He started talking about how important it was for us to think about our future together, about how relationships require sacrifice and compromise, about how success doesn't mean anything if you lose the people you love along the way. I felt my jaw clench. These were the exact words someone uses when they want to sound reasonable while asking you to give up your dreams. But Garrett wasn't finished. According to Natalie, he'd spent the next 2 hours systematically dismantling her confidence about the opportunity. He questioned whether she was really ready for that level of responsibility. He pointed out that Morrison & Associates had a reputation for burning through employees. Maybe they were targeting her because they thought she'd be easier to manipulate than someone with more experience. He said he was worried about me, Natalie whispered. He said he'd seen what happens to people who take on too much too fast, and he didn't want me to fail publicly and damage my reputation. The word fail hit me like a physical blow. Garrett had taken his girlfriend's biggest opportunity and reframed it as a potential humiliation. He'd made her excitement seem naive and her ambition seem dangerous. But the worst part was still coming. Then he started talking about timing, Natalie continued, about how we'd been discussing moving in together, maybe getting engaged next year. He said if I took this job, with all the hours and travel, we'd barely see each other. He asked me if the promotion was really more important than our relationship. I wanted to scream. Garrett had waited until Natalie was emotionally invested in their future together, then used that investment as leverage to control her career decisions. It was manipulation disguised as love, and it was devastatingly effective. "What did you tell him?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. Natalie's face crumpled. I told him I needed to think about it. I said maybe he was right, maybe it was too much too soon. I said I'd call Morrison & Associates in the morning and withdraw from consideration. "Please tell me you didn't." "I called them 20 minutes ago," she sobbed. "I told them I'd decided to stay with my current position for personal reasons. They were so nice about it, Camila. They said they understood, and if I ever changed my mind, I should call them." But I could hear the disappointment in the woman's voice. She probably thinks I'm just another person who talks big but doesn't follow through. I sat there staring at my sister, watching her dissolve into guilt and regret, and felt something snap inside me. This wasn't just about Natalie anymore. This was about every woman who'd ever been convinced to make herself smaller so a man could feel bigger. Every person who'd been talked out of their dreams by someone who claimed to love them. "Natalie," I said carefully, "what did Garrett say when you told him you'd called them?" She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. He was so relieved. He said he knew I'd make the smart choice. He said this proved how mature our relationship was, how we could work through difficult decisions together. He said he was proud of me for prioritizing what really mattered. The casual cruelty of that response, celebrating her sacrifice as proof of their relationship's strength, made me physically nauseous. Garrett had successfully convinced Natalie to torpedo her own career, then praised her for being, quote, enough to choose him over her professional growth. "But, Camila," Natalie continued, "I can't stop thinking about it. What if this was my one chance? What if Morrison & Associates never looks at me again? What if I just made the biggest mistake of my career because I was too scared to believe in myself?" That's when she really broke down. Not just crying, but the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that come from recognizing you've betrayed yourself in a way you might never recover from. I held my sister while she cried, and I made a decision that would change everything. Natalie, I said when her tears finally slowed, what if I told you there might be a way to fix this? She looked at me with desperate hope. What do you mean? I took a deep breath. I'd been planning to keep my new position secret until my official start date, but watching my sister sacrifice her dreams for someone who didn't deserve her loyalty changed my priorities. I can't tell you all the details yet, I said carefully, but I want you to call Morrison and Associates back. Tell them you've reconsidered, that you'd like to schedule the interview if the position is still available. But what about Garrett? What about our relationship? I looked at my sister, brilliant, talented, generous Natalie, who'd just been convinced to throw away the opportunity of a lifetime, and felt a cold clarity settle over me. Let me worry about Garrett, I said. You just focus on getting that interview. What I didn't tell her was that I already had a plan for dealing with Mr. Thornfield. In exactly 1 week, I'd be walking into Meridian Industries as the new CEO. And one of my first priorities was going to be evaluating whether junior associates who pressured their girlfriends to sabotage their careers had the kind of judgment and character we wanted representing our company. But first I had some calls to make. Because if Morrison and Associates was half the company I thought they were about to receive a very interesting recommendation about a certain marketing specialist named Natalie Rodriguez. And if Garrett Thornfield thought he could manipulate my sister's career without consequences, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. The game was about to change, and he had no idea who he was really playing against. The phone call I made that afternoon changed everything, though at the time it felt like the smallest possible step toward justice. I'd spent hours after leaving Natalie's apartment walking through Riverside Park, trying to process what I'd witnessed and decide how to handle it. The more I thought about Garrett's systematic destruction of my sister's confidence and career prospects, the angrier I became. But anger without strategy is just noise, and I needed to be strategic. I started with Rebecca Morrison, the founder of Morrison and Associates. We'd met 2 years earlier at a consulting conference in Chicago, and I'd been impressed by her firm's innovative approach to integrated marketing campaigns. When I called her office that Tuesday afternoon, her assistant initially tried to schedule something for the following week. Actually, I said, this is about a candidate you just spoke with this morning, Natalie Rodriguez. I think there might have been a misunderstanding. Rebecca took my call immediately. Camila Santos, she said warmly, I was just thinking about you. Didn't you move back to Ashford recently? I heard through the grapevine that you were making some interesting career moves. The grapevine in consulting circles is surprisingly efficient. Rebecca clearly knew something about my situation, though probably not the specifics. That's actually part of why I'm calling, I said. Natalie Rodriguez is my sister, and I have reason to believe her withdrawal from your senior specialist position wasn't entirely her decision. I explained the situation carefully, without revealing too much about my own upcoming role at Meridian. Rebecca listened with the kind of focused attention that successful executives give to information that might affect their business decisions. That's particularly unfortunate, Rebecca said when I finished, because Natalie was our top choice for the position. Her portfolio work is exactly what we're looking for, and her approach to client relationship building impressed everyone on our team. We were prepared to make an offer this afternoon. What if I told you she might be available to reschedule that interview? I'd say we're very interested in having that conversation. But Camila, if there are personal issues affecting her professional decisions, we need to know she can handle the demands of this role. This was the crucial moment. I could protect Natalie's privacy and hope for the best, or I could give Rebecca the context she needed to understand that my sister's withdrawal had nothing to do with her professional capabilities. Rebecca, what if I guaranteed personally that any external pressures affecting her decision-making would be resolved within the next 2 weeks? There was a pause. Rebecca Morrison hadn't built a successful marketing firm by ignoring subtext. That's a very specific timeline, she said carefully. And a very confident guarantee. I'm a very confident person. All right, have Natalie call me tomorrow morning. We'll reschedule for Thursday afternoon, and we'll pretend this morning's conversation never happened. The next call was harder. I needed to reach out to Dr. Evelyn Cross, the board chair at Meridian Industries, without revealing too much about my personal motivations. Officially, I wasn't supposed to start for another week, and I certainly wasn't supposed to be conducting unofficial investigations into junior associates. But Dr. Cross had been navigating corporate politics for 30 years. When I called her office and asked for a confidential conversation about cultural concerns I'd observed during my transition period, she understood immediately. "Camila," she said during our call that evening, "I hope you know that anything you share with me will be handled with complete discretion. But I also hope you understand that if there are issues affecting company culture, we need to address them appropriately." I chose my words carefully. I've become aware of a junior associate whose approach to professional relationships raises some concerns about judgment and character. Nothing illegal, but potentially damaging to client relationships and team dynamics. Are we talking about harassment, discrimination, ethical violations? More like a pattern of undermining colleagues and using personal relationships to control professional opportunities. The kind of behavior that creates toxic workplace dynamics, even when it doesn't violate specific policies. Dr. Cross was quiet for a moment. "Do you have documentation?" "I have observations and witness accounts, and I believe if we look carefully at this person's workplace behavior, we'll find similar patterns there." "Give me a name." "Garrett Thornfield." Another pause. Longer this time. "Interesting," Dr. Cross said finally. "We've actually received some informal feedback about Mr. Thornfield recently. Nothing actionable, but enough to make us wonder about his fit with company values." This was news to me. What kind of feedback? A client mentioned feeling uncomfortable with his approach during a presentation. Something about being dismissive toward female colleagues and taking credit for work he hadn't done. And Patricia Walsh has expressed some concerns about his teamwork skills. Patricia Walsh, the senior partner Garrett had dismissed as, quote, "legacy dead weight" during our first dinner. Apparently his workplace behavior was as problematic as his personal behavior. "What are you thinking?" Dr. Cross asked. "I'm thinking that my first week as CEO might be a good time to conduct some thorough performance reviews," I said. "Especially for employees whose behavior might not align with the culture we want to build." "I think that's excellent leadership instinct," Dr. Cross replied. "And Camila? Whatever personal connection brought this to your attention, I'm glad you felt comfortable sharing it with me. This is exactly the kind of proactive culture management we hired you to provide." After hanging up, I sat in my apartment and realized I was no longer just planning to help Natalie. I was planning to fundamentally change the trajectory of Garrett Thornfield's career, and I was going to do it using nothing but his own behavior as evidence. The third call I made was to my old mentor in Seattle, David Chen. If I was going to take down someone who had the potential to cause problems, I needed to make sure I had backup plans in case things got complicated. "David," I said when he answered, "I need some advice about handling a difficult employee situation." David had been dealing with workplace politics for 20 years. When I explained the situation, carefully avoiding personal details, he gave me exactly the perspective I needed. "The key," he said, "is documentation and witnesses. Never make it about personal dislike or personality conflicts. Make it about professional behavior, client impact, and team dynamics. If this person is really as problematic as you're describing, other people will have noticed. You just need to create a safe space for those observations to be shared." Any advice on timing? Strike while you have momentum and authority. New leadership has a brief window where people expect changes. Use that window to address problems that previous management might have been too comfortable to tackle. That's when I knew exactly what I was going to do. Thursday afternoon, while Natalie was interviewing at Morrison & Associates, I drove downtown to the Meridian Industries building. Not to go inside, I wasn't officially starting until Monday, but to observe. I sat in the lobby cafe across the street and watched employees coming and going during their lunch break. I was looking for Garrett Thornfield. I found him at 12:45, walking out of the elevator with two other junior associates. Even from across the street, I could see the dynamics David had warned me about. Garrett was talking animatedly while the other two listened with polite attention that looked more obligatory than engaged. When they reached the sidewalk, Garrett gestured toward an upscale restaurant while his colleagues glanced at each other with expressions that said they'd rather eat somewhere more affordable. I watched Garrett's body language as they walked, the way he positioned himself slightly ahead of the group, the gestures that claimed space, the casual assumption that his preferences would determine their plans. Everything about his movement suggested someone who was used to getting his way through persistence and subtle pressure. This was the man who had convinced my sister to sabotage her own career. This was the person who had spent months systematically undermining her confidence while positioning himself as her protector and guide. But starting Monday morning, I was going to be his boss, and I was very interested in learning more about his professional performance. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. "Interview went amazing. They offered me the job on the spot, starting next Monday. Thank you for convincing me to call them back. I feel like I can breathe again." I smiled, watching Garrett disappear into the restaurant, where he was probably explaining to his colleagues why their lunch choices reflected their lack of ambition. Next Monday was going to be a very interesting day for both Natalie and Garrett Thornfield. The difference was, only one of them knew what was coming. The weekend before my official start date, I did something that might seem obsessive but felt absolutely necessary. I spent 48 hours conducting the most thorough background research of my career. Not on market trends or strategic planning, but on one junior associate named Garrett Thornfield. If I was going to dismantle someone's career, I needed to make sure I had every piece of evidence lined up perfectly. I started with the obvious sources. LinkedIn showed me Garrett's professional trajectory: Northwestern University MBA, decent grades, internships at mid-tier consulting firms, before landing at Meridian Industries 18 months ago. His profile was meticulously crafted, full of buzzwords about innovative solutions and driving transformational change. Every recommendation read like it had been carefully negotiated rather than spontaneously offered. But it was the gaps that told the real story. No recommendations from direct supervisors, only from peers and one former professor. No client testimonials, despite claims of exceeding client expectations consistently. And most tellingly, no evidence of any sustained project leadership despite 18 months at the company. Friday evening, I drove to Patricia Walsh's neighborhood. Not to stalk her, that would have been crossing a line I wasn't willing to cross, but to attend a public lecture she was giving at the Ashford Public Library about women in business. I'd seen it advertised in the local paper and realized it was the perfect opportunity to observe her without any official connection to Meridian Industries. Patricia was everything I'd hoped she would be: sharp, experienced, and refreshingly direct about the challenges facing women in consulting. During the Q&A session, someone asked about managing difficult colleagues, and her response was illuminating. "The hardest part of leadership," she said, "isn't dealing with people who are obviously incompetent. It's dealing with people who are just competent enough to avoid being fired, but toxic enough to poison team dynamics. They often present well to senior management while making life miserable for everyone else." After the lecture, I approached her during the reception. "Ms. Walsh? I'm Camila Santos. I'm starting at Meridian on Monday as the new CEO." Her face lit up with genuine excitement. "Camila, I've been looking forward to meeting you. I read your Harvard Business Review piece on adaptive leadership. Brilliant work. We talked for 20 minutes about industry trends and company culture. I didn't mention Garrett directly, but I asked about challenges facing junior associates and how senior staff could better support emerging talent. Most of our junior people are fantastic," Patricia said. "Eager to learn, collaborative, willing to put in the work. But occasionally we get someone who seems to think consulting is a zero-sum game. Like, their success requires other people's failure. How do you handle those situations?" Patricia's expression grew thoughtful, carefully. People like that are often very good at managing up while managing down poorly. They charm senior partners while undermining peers and support staff. The trick is documenting patterns rather than individual incidents. I filed that advice away for Monday morning. Saturday, I spent 6 hours in coffee shops around downtown Ashford, striking up conversations with people who worked in the business district. Not anything formal or invasive, just the kind of casual networking that happens naturally when professionals recognize each other. I was looking for anyone who might have worked with Meridian Industries, either as clients or vendors. What I found was fascinating. 3 different people mentioned experiences with Meridian that involved a, quote, young, aggressive associate who had left them feeling uncomfortable. Nobody remembered his name, but the descriptions were consistent. Someone who talked over female colleagues, took credit for teamwork, and made condescending comments disguised as helpful advice. One woman, Sarah, worked for a nonprofit that had hired Meridian for a strategic planning project 6 months earlier. There was this junior guy who kept explaining our own programs to us, she said, rolling her eyes. Like we didn't understand our own mission because we hadn't gone to business school. It was so frustrating that we almost canceled the contract. Another contact, Marcus, worked in procurement for a manufacturing company. Meridian did great work for us, he said. But there was one associate who seemed more interested in impressing us with his vocabulary than understanding our actual needs. Our CFO specifically requested that he not be involved in future projects. By Saturday evening, I had a clear picture of Garrett's professional reputation outside the walls of Meridian Industries. He was developing a pattern of client dissatisfaction that the company probably wasn't even aware of yet. Sunday morning, I made a decision that pushed the boundaries of ethical behavior, but felt justified given what was at stake. I called Jennifer Kim, a former colleague from my Seattle days, who now worked in executive recruiting. Jennifer specialized in placing consulting talent, and her network included people at firms across the country. Jennifer, I said, I need a favor. Can you make some discreet inquiries about someone's professional reputation? Nothing that would get back to them. Just general market feedback. This sounds ominous, Jennifer replied, but she was curious enough to listen. I gave her Garrett's name and basic background, framing it as due diligence for a potential hire rather than investigation of a current employee. Jennifer called me back Sunday evening with information that made my stomach clench. Your guy Garrett Thornfield has applied to at least 6 firms in the past year, she said. Always looking for senior associate or junior partner roles, always claiming he's being held back by, quote, political dynamics at his current company. This was news to me. Garrett was actively trying to leave Meridian while telling Natalie about his bright future there. But here's the interesting part, Jennifer continued. 2 of the firms actually called his references. Both got lukewarm responses. Nothing actionable, but not the enthusiastic endorsements you'd expect for someone claiming to be a top performer. What kind of lukewarm? Comments like meets expectations and, quote, shows initiative, the kind of language you use when you can't say anything positive but don't want to be sued for defamation. By Sunday evening, I had assembled a comprehensive picture of Garrett Thornfield's professional and personal behavior patterns. The evidence was overwhelming. He was manipulative, credit-stealing, condescending, and actively looking to leave the company while sabotaging my sister's career prospects. But I needed one more piece of evidence before I could act decisively. Sunday night, I called Dr. Cross for a final consultation before my first day. Evelyn, I said, I want to discuss the process for conducting thorough performance reviews during my first weeks as CEO. What are you thinking? I want to schedule one-on-one meetings with every junior and senior associate, ostensibly to understand current projects and get team feedback. But really, I want to create opportunities for people to share honest observations about workplace dynamics. Dr. Cross was quiet for a moment. That's an excellent approach for a new CEO. Very standard practice. If certain patterns emerge during those conversations, we'll have a clear foundation for any personnel decisions. And if those patterns suggest someone isn't a good cultural fit, then we address it appropriately, with full documentation and following company protocols. Monday morning was 12 hours away. Natalie was starting her dream job at Morrison & Associates, excited and confident for the first time in months. Garrett was probably preparing talking points for impressing the new CEO he'd never met. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the weekend building a professional case against him that had nothing to do with his treatment of my sister and everything to do with his treatment of clients, colleagues, and company culture. The personal motivation had led me to the evidence, but the evidence would speak for itself. Tomorrow, the real game would begin. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes everything feel possible. I stood in front of my closet at 6 a.m., choosing my outfit with the same care a general might select armor before battle. Not because I wanted to intimidate anyone, but because I needed to feel completely confident in my own authority when I walked into that building. I settled on a navy blue suit, classic, professional, unmistakably executive, paired with the pearl earrings my mother had given me for my college graduation. She told me they would bring me confidence during important moments. I'd never needed them more than today. The drive to Meridian Industries took 12 minutes, enough time for me to run through my strategy one final time. First, I'd conduct my scheduled meetings with senior partners to discuss current projects and team dynamics. Then I'd begin the individual performance reviews, starting with junior associates who'd been flagged for, quote, cultural assessment. Garrett Thornfield's name was on that list, though he didn't know it yet. The Meridian Industries building was exactly what you'd expect from a successful consulting firm: glass and steel, tasteful modern art in the lobby, the kind of understated elegance that whispered, "We handle serious money for serious people." I'd visited during my interview process, but walking in as CEO felt completely different. This time people were watching. My assistant, Margaret Shen, no relation to my mentor David, met me at the elevator with a coffee and my schedule for the day. Margaret had been Catherine Meridian's assistant for 8 years, and her institutional knowledge was going to be invaluable during my transition. "Dr. Cross asked me to remind you about the all-staff meeting at 10 a.m., Margaret said as we rode to the executive floor. "She wants you to introduce yourself formally to everyone who wasn't part of the interview process." Perfect. The all-staff meeting would give me my first opportunity to observe Garrett in a professional setting, to see how he interacted with colleagues when he thought the new CEO was just another face in the crowd. My office was on the corner of the 15th floor, with windows overlooking downtown Ashford and enough space for a conference table that could seat 8 people. Catherine Meridian had left it meticulously organized, with transition notes on every major client and detailed assessments of senior staff performance. But what caught my attention was a manila folder labeled Personnel Concerns, sitting prominently on the desk. Inside were 6 months' worth of informal complaints and observations about various employees. Most were minor: tardiness, missed deadlines, communication issues that could be addressed through coaching. But one name appeared more frequently than others: Garrett Thornfield. The complaints were subtle but consistent. A client who'd requested he not be assigned to future projects. A colleague who'd reported feeling undermined during team presentations. A support staff member who'd mentioned feeling, quote, down to during project briefings. No single incident was serious enough to warrant formal discipline, but together they painted a picture of someone whose interpersonal skills were becoming a liability. At 9:45, I made my way to the main conference room for the all-staff meeting. About 40 people were gathered around the large oval table and in chairs along the walls, everyone from senior partners to administrative assistants. I spotted Garrett immediately, sitting in the 3rd row with 2 other junior associates, wearing what I was beginning to recognize as his important meeting expression, attentive but slightly superior, like he was evaluating everyone else's performance. Dr. Cross introduced me with appropriate ceremony. highlighting my background and vision for the company's future. I gave a brief speech about collaboration, innovation, and maintaining the culture of excellence that Meridian had built. Standard new CEO remarks, but I watched faces carefully as I spoke. Most people looked genuinely interested and optimistic. The senior partners nodded approvingly at my comments about respecting institutional knowledge while embracing new approaches. Support staff seemed pleased when I mentioned the importance of every team member's contribution to client success. But Garrett's expression was fascinating to watch. He nodded at all the right moments, but there was something calculating in his eyes, like he was already figuring out how to position himself as an ally to the new leadership. When I mentioned conducting individual meetings with staff members to better understand current projects, I saw him straighten slightly, probably interpreting this as an opportunity to bypass Patricia Walsh and make his case directly to the CEO. After the meeting, people approached me with welcomes and introductions. Patricia Walsh was among the first, expressing genuine enthusiasm about working together and offering to brief me on the most complex client relationships. Several other senior associates mentioned specific challenges they were hoping the new leadership could address. But it was the conversation with Jennifer Hayes, a junior associate, that gave me the opening I'd been waiting for. "Miss Santos," Jennifer said quietly after most people had left the conference room, "I wanted to mention that I'm really excited about your emphasis on collaborative culture. Sometimes it can be challenging when team dynamics aren't optimal." I gave her my full attention. "What do you mean by that?" Jennifer glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Well, there are some people who are great individual contributors but struggle with teamwork. And sometimes that affects project outcomes, even when the individual work quality is good. Can you give me a specific example?" Last month, I was working on the Riverside healthcare analysis with Garrett Thornfield and 2 other associates. Garrett had some really good insights about operational efficiency, but when we presented to the client, he presented all of our findings as if they were primarily his work. The client actually asked afterward who had done the financial modeling, because they wanted to compliment that person specifically, but Garrett had already taken credit for it. This was exactly the kind of first-hand account I needed. How did that make you feel about working with him on future projects? Honestly, I'd rather not. It's not just the credit issue, though that's frustrating. It's more that he has this way of making you feel like your contributions aren't as valuable as his, like he's doing you a favor by including you in his projects. I asked Jennifer if she'd be willing to document this experience in more detail, framing it as part of my effort to understand team dynamics and project management processes. She agreed immediately. Over the next 2 hours, I had similar conversations with 3 other junior associates, 2 senior consultants, and 1 administrative coordinator. The pattern was unmistakable. Garrett Thornfield was systematically alienating colleagues while maintaining plausible deniability about his behavior. But the most damning evidence came from Patricia Walsh during our one-on-one meeting at 2 p.m. "Patricia," I said, settling into my office conference area, "I want to understand the current dynamics among our junior associates. Who are the rising stars, and who might need additional coaching or development?" Patricia had clearly been hoping for this conversation. "Most of our junior people are excellent," she began. "Jennifer Hayes is probably our strongest analyst. Marcus Thompson has incredible client relationship skills, and Rebecca Park is doing innovative work on digital transformation strategies. And areas of concern?" Patricia chose her words carefully. "There's one associate whose professional development has been challenging, Garrett Thornfield. Technically competent, but struggling with teamwork and client relations. Can you be more specific?" 3 clients have requested he not be assigned to their accounts, not because of poor work quality, but because of communication issues. He tends to lecture rather than listen, and he has trouble accepting feedback or direction from client contacts, especially if they're women or if they don't have traditional business backgrounds. This was the smoking gun I'd been hoping for. Client complaints were taken seriously at consulting firms, and multiple client complaints were career-limiting. Has this been addressed with him directly? I've had several coaching conversations with Garrett about professional communication and team collaboration. Each time, he's been receptive in the moment, but the behavior patterns haven't changed. If anything, he seems to interpret feedback as evidence that he's being held back by people who don't appreciate his potential. Patricia paused, then added, I should probably mention that he's been asking about promotion timelines and hinting that he might be more valued at other firms. I get the impression he's considering leaving. This was perfect. If Garrett was already positioning himself as undervalued and considering other opportunities, it would make the conversation I was planning much easier to navigate. Patricia, I'd like to schedule a performance review meeting with Garrett this week. Can you prepare a summary of the client feedback and team collaboration issues? I want to address these concerns directly. Of course. Should I give him advance notice about the topic? No, I said, smiling for the first time that day. Let's keep it as a general check-in about his current projects and professional goals. I find those conversations are more productive when people don't have time to prepare defensive responses. As Patricia left my office, I looked out the windows at downtown Ashford and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Everything was falling into place exactly as I'd hoped. I had documented evidence of professional problems, multiple witness accounts of problematic behavior, and legitimate business reasons for addressing Garrett's future with the company. Tomorrow I'd be having a very interesting conversation with Mr. Thornfield, and this time I wouldn't be the one who needed to worry about staying in my place. Tuesday afternoon at 3 p.m., Garrett Thornfield knocked on my office door with the confident smile of someone who thought he was about to charm his way into the new CEO's inner circle. He'd dressed for the occasion. His most expensive suit, the tie that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, and that calculated expression of ambitious professionalism I'd seen him practice at networking events. Miss Santos, he said, extending his hand for what was clearly meant to be an impressive handshake. Thank you so much for making time to meet with me. I've been looking forward to this conversation since the announcement about your appointment. I gestured for him to take a seat at my conference table, positioning myself across from him with a manila folder containing 6 months of documented complaints, client feedback, and performance observations. Garrett didn't know what was in that folder, but he was about to find out. Please call me Camila, I said pleasantly. I like to keep things informal during these transition conversations. How are you finding things at Meridian these days? Garrett's face lit up like I'd just asked him to deliver his favorite sales pitch. Honestly, I'm thrilled about the new leadership direction. Catherine Meridian built something incredible here, but I think there's so much untapped potential. With fresh perspectives like yours, I can see us really taking the company to the next level. He leaned forward slightly, adopting what I recognized as his serious business conversation posture. I have to say, your background is exactly what this firm needs. Someone who understands that consulting is evolving, that we need to be more aggressive about innovation and efficiency. I nodded encouragingly, letting him build momentum. In my experience, people like Garrett always revealed more than they intended when they thought they had a sympathetic audience. I actually have some ideas about operational improvements that I'd love to share with you, he continued. Ways we could streamline our project management processes, optimize team compositions, maybe update some of our more traditional approaches to client relationships. That sounds interesting, I said. What kind of traditional approaches are you thinking about? This was the moment Garrett made his first critical mistake. Instead of speaking generally about process improvements, he launched into a detailed critique of his colleagues that revealed exactly the kind of thinking that had been creating problems for months. Well, for example, we have some senior staff who are very attached to what I'd call legacy client relationships. They spend a lot of time on hand-holding and emotional management, instead of focusing on delivering measurable results. It's not efficient, and I don't think it's what clients actually want from a consulting firm. I kept my expression neutral. Can you be more specific? Take Patricia Walsh, Garrett said, apparently feeling comfortable enough to name names. She's been here forever, and she has this maternal approach to client relationships. Lots of check-in calls, lots of, "How are you feeling about the process?" conversations. But at the end of the day, clients want solutions, not therapy sessions. He was digging his own grave, and he had no idea. Patricia Walsh's client retention rate was above 90%, precisely because of her relationship-focused approach. "What about team dynamics?" I asked. "How would you describe the collaboration among junior associates?" Garrett's expression shifted slightly, and I could see him recalibrating his response. "Most of the junior staff are great to work with," he said carefully, "though I do think some of them could benefit from more strategic thinking about project priorities." "What do you mean by that?" "Sometimes people get very focused on individual contributions instead of thinking about overall project success. Like, they'll spend a lot of energy making sure they get credit for specific tasks instead of focusing on delivering the best possible outcome for the client." The irony was staggering. This was exactly what multiple colleagues had accused him of doing, taking credit for teamwork while positioning others as insufficiently strategic. "Garrett," I said, opening the folder in front of me, "I want to share some feedback that's come to my attention during my transition meetings." His confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Feedback?" "I've been conducting one-on-one meetings with staff members to understand current team dynamics and project management approaches. Several people have mentioned some concerns about collaborative processes." I pulled out Jennifer Hayes' written account of the Riverside Healthcare project. "For instance, there seems to have been some confusion about credit attribution during the recent Riverside presentation. Can you help me understand what happened there?" Garrett's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, defensive preparation. "The Riverside project was a great success," he said slowly. "I think there might have been some miscommunication about roles and responsibilities, but the client was very satisfied with the outcome." "Actually," I said, pulling out another document, "the client specifically requested that you not be assigned to their future projects. They felt that the presentation style didn't align with their collaborative culture." This was the moment Garrett realized he wasn't in a friendly getting-to-know-you meeting anymore. His whole demeanor shifted from confident networking to damage control. "I think there might be some misunderstandings here," he said, his voice taking on a more careful tone. "Sometimes when you're focused on delivering high-quality results, personality conflicts can arise. I'm always open to coaching on communication styles." I pulled out the summary Patricia Walsh had prepared. "This isn't about communication style, Garrett. I have documented feedback from 3 separate clients requesting you not be assigned to their accounts. I have accounts from multiple colleagues describing patterns of taking credit for teamwork. I have reports of condescending interactions with support staff." Garrett stared at the papers in front of me, and I could see him processing the fact that his behavior had been noticed, documented, and was now being presented as evidence of professional problems. "I think some of these concerns might be based on misunderstandings," he said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "I'm very committed to professional development, and I'd welcome the opportunity to address any specific issues through coaching or training." "That's good to hear," I said, "but I have to ask, do you think Meridian Industries is the right fit for your career goals?" This was the question I'd been building toward. Garrett had been actively job hunting and complaining about being undervalued. Now I was giving him an opportunity to position his departure as his own choice, rather than disciplinary action. "What do you mean?" he asked, though I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. "Well, you mentioned having ideas about innovation and efficiency that might not align with our current culture. And I understand you've been exploring opportunities at other firms that might be more aligned with your professional vision." Garrett went very still. He hadn't realized that his job hunting activities had been noticed. "I'm always interested in professional growth opportunities," he said carefully, "but I'm committed to Meridian Industries." "Here's what I'm thinking," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Given the client feedback and team dynamics issues, And given your apparent interest in different approaches to consulting, maybe we should discuss a transition timeline that works for everyone. A transition timeline? I'm prepared to offer you a generous severance package and positive references for your job search, contingent on a smooth 2-week transition and professional handling of your current client responsibilities. Garrett stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to process how this conversation had gone from networking opportunity to termination meeting. "You're firing me?" he asked. "I'm offering you an opportunity to pursue the kind of consulting environment that might be a better fit for your professional goals," I said calmly. "The alternative is a formal performance improvement plan that would address the documented issues with client relationships and team collaboration. The choice was clear: leave gracefully with a positive reference, or stay and face formal discipline that would make future job searches much more difficult." Garrett chose wisely. "I appreciate the opportunity for a smooth transition," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. 2 weeks should be sufficient to wrap up my current projects." As he left my office, I felt a deep sense of professional satisfaction. This had nothing to do with personal revenge, and everything to do with addressing documented workplace problems. Garrett Thornfield was leaving Meridian Industries because his behavior had created legitimate business issues, not because he'd mistreated my sister. Though I had to admit, the timing was absolutely perfect. That evening, I called Natalie to hear about her second day at Morrison & Associates. She was practically glowing with excitement about her new projects and colleagues. "Oh, and Camila," she said as we wrapped up our conversation, "Garrett got some kind of career opportunity that's going to require him to leave Ashford. Isn't that exciting?" He seemed a little stressed about it, but I think it's going to be great for him. I smiled, looking out my apartment window at the city lights. I'm sure it will be exactly what he deserves. 3 months later, I was sitting in my office reviewing quarterly performance reports when Margaret knocked on my door with an expression that meant she had interesting news to share. "Camila," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I thought you'd want to know. I just got off the phone with Rebecca Morrison. She wanted to thank you again for the recommendation, but she also had some fascinating updates about both Natalie and Garrett." I set down my reports, genuinely curious about how both stories had evolved since that October afternoon when everything changed. "Natalie first," Margaret continued, clearly saving the best for last. "Rebecca says she's already being considered for a promotion to senior marketing strategist. Apparently, her work on the Clearwater Hospital campaign exceeded every expectation, and 3 other clients have specifically requested her for their projects." This didn't surprise me at all. Natalie had always been brilliant at her work. She just needed an environment where her talents were recognized and encouraged instead of undermined and diminished. She's also been invited to present at the Regional Marketing Excellence Conference next month, Margaret added. Rebecca thinks she has the potential to become a department head within 2 years. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with business metrics and everything to do with watching someone I loved finally get the recognition she deserved. But I was even more curious about the second part of Margaret's update. "And Garrett?" Margaret's smile took on a slightly wicked edge. "Well, that's where things get really interesting. Apparently, he landed at Brennan & Associates. You know that boutique firm that specializes in aggressive cost-cutting strategies?" I knew Brennan & Associates by reputation. They were the firm companies hired when they wanted to slash expenses without caring about long-term relationships or employee morale. Exactly the kind of environment that would appeal to someone like Garrett. How's that working out for him? According to Rebecca, not well. She heard through her network that Garrett lasted exactly 6 weeks before his new colleagues started complaining about his approach to client relationships. Apparently, he tried to implement some kind of efficiency protocols that involved cutting what he called non-essential client communications. I could picture it perfectly. Garrett walking into a new company and immediately trying to change their processes based on his theories about what clients really wanted, without bothering to understand the relationships that were already working. But the real story, Margaret continued, is what happened when he tried to apply his approach to Brennan's biggest client, the Riverside Medical Group. My heart stopped for a moment. Riverside Medical was the same healthcare system where Natalie had done her breakthrough campaign work, the project that had originally caught Morrison and Associates' attention. "Please tell me this is going where I think it's going," I said. "Oh, it gets better." Garrett apparently didn't realize that Dr. Sarah Castellanos, Riverside's chief operating officer, had worked closely with Natalie on the original marketing strategy. When Garrett presented his, quote, streamlined communication plan that would eliminate what he called unnecessary emotional support from their consulting relationship, Dr. Castellanos asked him if he'd ever worked with Natalie Rodriguez. I could see where this was heading, and it was more beautiful than I could have imagined. Garrett, being Garrett, apparently said something about how he'd provided mentorship to Natalie during her early career development, and how her success was a testament to his guidance in helping her think more strategically about business objectives. The audacity was breathtaking, even for Garrett. Taking credit for Natalie's success after spending months trying to sabotage her confidence was exactly the kind of behavior that had gotten him into trouble at Meridian. Dr. Castellanos called Rebecca Morrison that afternoon, Margaret concluded. Not only did she clarify the real story about Natalie's work and Garrett's actual role in it, but she also shared her concerns about Garrett's approach with his supervisors at Brennan and Associates. And Garrett Thornfield is currently unemployed and, according to Rebecca's sources, having a very difficult time finding consulting work in the region. Word travels fast in professional networks, especially when someone develops a reputation for taking credit for other people's successes. I sat back in my chair, processing the perfect symmetry of it all. Garrett had tried to control Natalie's career by convincing her she wasn't qualified for better opportunities. Now his own career was being limited by the professional reputation he'd created through his own behavior. "There's one more thing," Margaret added. Rebecca mentioned that Dr. Castellanos specifically requested that Morrison and Associates be considered for Riverside's next major project. Apparently, she was so impressed with their integrity in clarifying the situation with Garrett that she wants to work with a firm that values honesty and collaboration. This was the part that made everything worthwhile. Natalie's career wasn't just recovering from Garrett's sabotage. It was thriving because of the authentic relationships she'd built and the genuine value she'd created. Meanwhile, Garrett was facing the natural consequences of his own choices, without any intervention or revenge required from me. That evening, I drove to Natalie's new apartment in the Riverside district, a beautiful 2-bedroom place she'd been able to afford thanks to her promotion and raise at Morrison and Associates. She'd invited me for dinner to celebrate her conference presentation acceptance and to share some personal news. "Camila," she said as we settled on her couch with wine and takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant, "I need to tell you something about Garrett." My stomach tightened slightly. Even though he was no longer in our lives, I still worried about his ability to manipulate situations. "We broke up," she said simply. "Actually, I broke up with him." I tried to keep my expression neutral. "What happened?" "It was after he lost the job at Brennan and Associates. He started talking about how the consulting industry was rigged against people like him, how success was more about politics than performance. And then he started suggesting that maybe I could use my connections at Morrison to help him find opportunities." Natalie took a sip of wine, her expression thoughtful rather than upset. That's when I realized something I'd been avoiding for months. Garrett never celebrated my successes without trying to figure out how they could benefit him. When I got the promotion, his first response was to talk about how it proved his guidance had been effective. When I got the conference invitation, he immediately started talking about how we could leverage it for networking opportunities. This was the moment I'd been hoping for but hadn't dared to expect. Natalie recognizing the patterns on her own, without anyone having to explain them to her. I told him I thought we wanted different things, she continued. He wanted a girlfriend who would be grateful for his advice and support his ambitions. I wanted a partner who could be genuinely happy about my success without making it about himself. How did he respond to that? Natalie's smile was rueful but confident. He told me I was being ungrateful and that I'd never find anyone else who cared enough to help me reach my potential. That's when I knew I'd made the right decision. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and I felt a deep sense of closure that I hadn't expected. This story didn't end with dramatic confrontations or satisfying revenge. It ended with people facing the natural consequences of their choices and thriving when they were free to be their authentic selves. You know what the best part is? Natalie said, refilling our wine glasses. For the first time in months, I feel like myself again. Like my opinions matter, my work has value, and my dreams are worth pursuing. That night, as I drove home through the quiet streets of Ashford, I thought about the lessons I'd learned from watching Garrett Thornfield's brief but memorable impact on our lives. Sometimes the people who try to make you feel small are really just revealing how small they feel inside. Sometimes the best response to manipulation isn't confrontation. It's simply refusing to accept someone else's limitations as your own truth. And sometimes, when someone shows you who they really are, the most powerful thing you can do is believe them the first time and act accordingly. So here's my question for you. Who in your life has tried to convince you that their version of your worth is the truth? Maybe it was a boss who dismissed your ideas, a teacher who said you weren't smart enough, a partner who made you feel like your dreams were unrealistic, or a family member who treated your ambitions like character flaws. Whatever they said, whoever they were, I want you to know something. They don't get to write your story. Their insecurities don't define your potential. Their limitations don't become your boundaries. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop asking for permission to be excellent. Drop a comment and tell me about a time when someone underestimated you. Tell me what you accomplished when you stopped listening to their limitations and started trusting your own capabilities. Because I read every single comment, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The world needs more people who refuse to stay small for someone else's comfort. Don't let anyone convince you that you're just the help when you know you're capable of running the whole company. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.